But also events like this where it's Zoom, thank you for inviting me into your homes. Because, you know, normally we're in a community centre, church hall, whatever. And, you know, tonight I'm sitting in the corner of your living room, and I feel quite privileged doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'll bring up the screen with my PowerPoint presentation on so that you'll be able to see that. And press that button. And hopefully now you can see the opening screen. You've got a picture of a sailor. Yes, Rob's got his thumbs up. That's good. You've got a picture of a sailing ship on the left, which is an image from the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, and it's a picture of a slave ship. And until the painting was cleaned, people hadn't realised it was a slave ship, but when they cleaned it, they saw ventilation holes beneath the gun ports on the ship. You can see that the gun ports, their guns are out for some reason, but it has ventilation ports. On the right of the first screen, you've got, it was Haywood's Bank. It's now a bar. And it's in Brunswick Street, off Castle Street in Liverpool, if you're familiar with that. I know some people are from outside the area. And we'll be seeing Mr. Haywood a little bit later on in the thing. My email address is on the first screen, and it will also be on the last screen. Please, if you wish to take a note of it, if you'd like to contact me afterwards with questions, comments, thoughts or opinions, anything like that, I'm more than happy to read them, and I will certainly reply to anything that I receive. So let's get on. Right, so that didn't work again. That doesn't work for some reason. There we go. So I say normally this is slightly more interactive than it's going to be. I'm going to ask the question, I'm going to answer it myself because it's more easier that way. So when was the first slave voyage from Liverpool? The various dates are given: 1796, 1799, 1696. 1699 and 1700 are three dates that we've got potentially for the first slave voyage to come out from Liverpool. Of those, I'm inclined to believe the 1699 one, and one of the two ships that came out first was the Liverpool Merchant, and how appropriate is that name? We have a picture there of a ship lying off the coast of Africa, boarding kidnapped Africans. And here we have a question, so how many slave voyages started in Liverpool? And for roundest figures of all, you've got to say about 5,000. And that meant that Liverpool had more slave voyages than any other port in Europe. Not more slave voyages full stop, but more than any other in Europe. And why John Belcham from the University of Liverpool called it the slave capital of Europe, the slavery capital of Europe. The picture on the slide is the Brooks. And this is a model. You may be familiar with it. It's very common if you're looking at slavery. A model of a ship that was built for William Wilberforce, which went to the House of Commons and was part of his visual display asking for the abolition of the slave trade. And the diagram on the right is showing how the captives were packed into the ship. The Brooks was a Liverpool ship owned by Mr. Brooke, amongst others. So how many men, women and children were transported on Liverpool ships? Again, the widest possible look at this, we're talking about 1.5 million people. There are around about 500,000 people in Liverpool today. And if you empty the city out and refill it, empty the city out and refill it, and empty the city out for a third time, that's 1.5 million. A staggering number. And again, we've got a modernish image of enslaved, or in fact, I prefer to call them kidnapped Africans at this stage. They're not enslaved until they get to the Americas. Kidnapped Africans in the hold of a ship. So in what year was the transatlantic slave trade abolished by Britain? It was abolished by America on the same year, and Britain then started to put pressure on European countries to do it. I'm guessing most people will probably know 1807. We did I'll hold it up to the camera, you see it, a £2 coin to commemorate the bicentenary of it. So 1807 was when the slave trade was abolished. So what year did the last slave voyage leave Liverpool? You may say 1807. More probably, you may be shocked to hear that it was 1862, which is 55 years later. Now, that itself wasn't necessarily the last slave voyage. We know that that slave voyage happened because the ship that left Liverpool, the Allegra, with a Spanish flag on it, was captured by the Royal Navy off the coast of West Africa. There may have been voyages after that that weren't captured, weren't intercepted. The Allegra had a Spanish name, a Spanish captain, a Spanish flag, but the name, the log of one of the officers who was involved in the interception of the Allegra wrote at the end of a rather long log piece, he wrote in a rather bored hand, the only thing Spanish about that ship was the flag. There were ways round things these happened. In the 1850s, the United States sent a federal marshal from New York with a list of ships that they knew had been fitted out in Liverpool for the slave trade, the West African trade, the African trade. It was called a lot of things. And the federal marshal came to the council in Liverpool and said, you know, could you investigate this for us, please? Here's a list of some ships we know came from Liverpool. 2 weeks later, they went back to the guy, the marshal, and said, no, you must be mistaken. These ships haven't visited Liverpool. Here we have another couple of examples of it. We've got the wreck of the schooner, the Douro, wrecked off the Scilly Islands in 1843, and it was carrying slave goods, if you like. We'll see a bit later what was taken to Africa as slave goods. But amongst what was taken was, I'll just hold it up to I'm fiddling with this as I talk. This is called a manila, and it's copper. This is actually off the Douro. This was recovered from the Douro. And these were taken to Africa as a form of currency. You see, if I sort of put my fingers through it, it's way too small to be a bracelet. Even for a child, probably too small to be a bracelet. And it was just a form of currency. On the ship's manifest, it said that there were copper nails. Now, call me Mr. Picky, but you can't nail that into anything with two blunt ends. Picture on the right, you may have been familiar with the ship, the Lottie Sleigh, which exploded in the Sloyne off Rock Ferry, Birkenhead, 1864. That was carrying 11.5 tons of explosives, of gunpowder, specifically gunpowder, to West Africa. And that was, again, a common slave trade product. We'll see more about that later. So in what year was slavery abolished in the British Empire? The Slavery Abolition Act was passed in 1834. No, it wasn't. It was passed in 1833 to take effect in 1834. And yes, that was passed. So in what year was the last slave in the British Empire, as long as you weren't under the control of the East India Company or you weren't in the island of St. Helena? Which year was the last slave freed? And that was 1837. They wanted to introduce, in 1833, they wanted to introduce a 6-year apprenticeship period, saying that the enslaved people, having had everything provided for them, and that were incapable of living independent lives by themselves, so they would need 6 years to carry on not being paid and being, in inverted commas, looked after by their masters. And that was the idea. There was widespread dissent with that, but it did, let's say, last until 1837. As I say, unless you happen to have been in East India Company territory. I'm guessing that most people will have heard of the slave trade triangle, triangular trade. And here's a representation of it, the map of it. As you can see, it's a little bit more complicated than simply, as we're all told at school, I was told this at school, that goods would come from Britain to west coast of Africa. Kidnapped Africans will be taken from the west coast of Africa to the Americas. By the Americas, we're talking about what we'd now call the United States. We're talking about Central America, Southern America, and the West Indian Islands. And then goods would be brought back from there to Britain. But it was more complicated than just that. Manufactured goods were taken directly from Britain to the West Indies and to the Americas. Goods came directly from the Americas to Liverpool. Goods went from North America, from the United States, United States later on, obviously, to Africa, and they had their own slave trade as well. So you can see on there some of the things that they're talking about. And one of the things they talk about there is the Middle Passage. That was the route between West Africa and the Americas. Okay, so we've got here just from a book that Rob mentioned, The Dusty Teapot. The Dusty Teapot does facsimile books, so we do new books as well. And this is a book, William Enfield's History of Liverpool, 1773, and it's shown lists of exports to the West Indies, this particular 2 pages. Lots and lots of stuff taken out there. And then here we've got a list of imports from there. We're going to talk about that a little bit more detail in a while. So the kidnapped Africans came predominantly, in fact, almost entirely from the west coast of Africa, what we would now be calling Nigeria and Angola, the Gold Coast, Guinea, and places like that. And they went in greatest numbers in British ships, on Liverpool ships, to the West Indies, although a lot went also to South America, Central America, and to the southern states of the United States. There was also a trade in human beings between the West Indies and between America. So goods taken to Africa, I said we mentioned this before, they came from all over the place. The reason I keep glancing to one side, by the way, is I work on 2 screens, so I just need to read off my screen sometimes, as I said. I do know you can read, by the way. Printed cotton cloth from Manchester. Guns from Birmingham and Liverpool. There was a thriving trade in manufacturing guns in Liverpool. Glass beads from Venice. I have some. I'll hold them up. I hope you can see these things. They're quite small, but they're quite colourful, and these are actual beads from Venice. Wine from Spain and Portugal. Gunpowder from Ireland. Big trade in that. Silks from the Far East. So goods were coming from, literally from China into Britain to be re-exported to Africa. Swords and daggers from Sheffield. Rum from the Caribbean. There's a superb irony that rum cultivated by enslaved people in the West Indies was used to buy more kidnapped Africans in Africa. Copper from North Wales, we've seen in Manila, and cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean. The thing of cowrie shells there. All these, and of course, all these businesses, as well as the attendant businesses in Liverpool, the coopers who made the barrels, the sail makers, the rope makers, the people who made the blocks, the people who made the ships, lots and lots of people were involved directly in the slave trade. So what was purchased in Africa for these goods? What was purchased in Africa? Men, women, and children. Elephant's teeth. It's always referred to as elephant's teeth. It's ivory, obviously. Palm oil, gold, and timber. This is why gold was never taken to buy kidnapped Africans. They had plenty of gold in West Africa, thank you very much. So they're exporting it to us. But timber as well was taken. So the Africans that were bought by the people from Liverpool, by other British slave traders, by other traders from other European countries, were captured in wars and in raids, where one tribe would attack another tribe, capture some people, and then march them, sometimes 1,000 miles to the coast, where they would be bought by Europeans. You know, I'm afraid that somebody like myself with a couple of bad knees, just either from too much praying as a young man or too much rugby, I suspect rugby. And, you know, I would be killed out of hand, but my two sons, for example, would be taken, fit, strong young chaps would be taken to the coast and sold to Europeans. The Europeans didn't venture away from the coast. So broad men, women and children were taken. They were often separated. Families were often separated either at this stage, because it did depend. Different people as slave captains were going to different places, and different places wanted different types of captives. They might want young men. They might want women. Some in fact wanted children. So, you know, it depended where you were going, what the season was, what people were going to be doing when they got there, which people were taken. And it could just be, you know, families casually split up, like we've got in this image here. Here we've got a modern picture of an impression of the Middle Passage. So I mentioned just before, the route from Africa to the Americas. And we've got all sorts of things going on in this picture. We've got a chap, a white chap in the middle with a cat of nine tails. You can't particularly see it. It's a type of whip. And the African captives were forced to dance or to exercise or to run and jump about on the deck so that they're in decent condition when they got to the Americas. You know, they were forced by being beaten. You can see somebody to the left of the center of the screen. There's a net and there's a person jumping through that net. The nets on the sides of the ships were called suicide nets because people on the ships would sometimes, it was not infrequent, choose to kill themselves because they didn't know what was happening to them. They didn't know where they were going. Many of them thought that they were going to the land of the cannibals. They thought that the smelly cheese that the British sailors ate were brains, and they thought the red wine that they drank was blood. There's also, within certain religions in West Africa, the belief that if you were to die whole, you would be reincarnated whole in the village that you came from in Africa. So you would throw yourself off the ship to drown, thus dying whole, and you would be reincarnated at home. This is why if there was a slave revolt on a ship, the ringleaders of the slave revolt were mutilated. They're often beheaded so that this wouldn't think. On the right hand of the picture, you've got an African being force-fed. This is something else that happened. This is a choice that some people made not to eat and to starve themselves to death. This was, you know, considered better. And there's somebody being force-fed. And then even further on the right, you have somebody being branded. It was common for the people on the slave ships to brand their prisoners. So you've got all that going on the image there. So how many people were involved, directly involved as slavers or owners, part owners, investors of Liverpool slave voyages? And it's round about 2,000 in just over 100 years. It did all quieten off, but just over 100 years, some 2,000 people were involved. So I don't know if you can name a slave trade. All the people in this picture are slave traders. And, you know, there's some people there, I don't know, you may or not know them, so we better put some names to them. Come on. So we've got some names here. We've got top left there is Thomas Leyland. Thomas Leyland was probably the richest man ever to have lived in Liverpool. To give you some idea, he was even richer than Mike. He was that rich. And he left, when he died in 1827, he left somewhere in the region of £2 million. He had something like £700,000 in cash and government stocks, and he had about £1.3 million of of property. So that is, you know, what did I say, about 2 million. You're probably talking at about £2 billion now equivalent. He formed a bank, Leyland and Bullen's Bank, which we'll see a little bit more of later. Brian Blundell, a name you might know. He's going to come up later, so I won't mention him too much then. Thomas Leyland incidentally did 72 voyages, slave voyages. Brian Blundell did 3, but there's more to him. Richard Gildart. Richard Gildart did 6 voyages. I'm just going to leave a couple out. And we've got Arthur Hayward, bottom left there. The very first screen, we had Hayward's Bank in Brunswick Street. This is Arthur Hayward, who founded it with his brother, Benjamin. And Arthur Hayward was involved in 78 slave voyages. Hayward's Bank became the Bank of Liverpool, joined the Bank of Liverpool in the 1870s. And in 1919, it became part of Martin's Bank, which in 68 became part of Barclays Bank. James Penny, this is James Penny Sr. James Penny, with a lack of imagination, called his son James as well. And James Penny Sr. did 51 slave voyages. And James Penny Jr. did 23 slave voyages. Then we've got Samuel Staniforth, who did 13 slave voyages, and Sir John Tobin did 16 slave voyages. Now, I've left a couple of people out of that, the 2 people in the top right-hand corner. John Bridge Aspinall. The Aspinall family were big slave traders, the whole family, heavily involved. And John Bridge Aspinall did 113 slave voyages. They're somewhat amateurish compared with George Case in the top right-hand corner there. George Case was involved in 149 slave voyages. Of these people, Leyland, Blundell, Gildart, John Bridge Aspinall, Staniforth, and Arthur Hayward all became mayors of Liverpool. So this is a thing, I imagine most of you may recognise this. This is the frieze over the side of the town hall. If you look at the town hall from the front, the right-hand side of the town hall, this is a frieze. We have an African woman. We've got elephant's teeth, inverted commas, which is the ivory, and other trade goods from Africa there, symbolising, if you like, the importance of Africa and the African trade to Liverpool. So did enslaved people ever come to Liverpool? I put this in because it's a question I'm always asked, and I'll answer it straight away. I can. By showing you a little piece, tiny piece, from the Liverpool Mercury from the 12th of September, 1766. And in the middle of that piece, you can see, third from the top, to be sold at the Exchange Coffee House in Water Street this day, the 12th inst September, at 1 o'clock precisely, 11 Negroes, imported per the Angola, George Drinkwater, broker. When Africans were brought to Liverpool, it wasn't as slaves. They were brought often they were youngsters, often they were children, but not always, and they were sold as domestic servants. Horrible as it may sound, it was fashionable at the time for to have a black boy or a black girl in beautiful liveried outfit, perhaps carrying her ladyship's handkerchief behind her, or perhaps playing music in a band. It was, it's a horrible thing to say, but it's true. They were a fashion statement. You see these strange people, these so-called celebrities carrying a miniature dog in their handbag. It was like that. Now you could say, well, they're free. They could have gone. They could, but where could they go? If you imagine, a child of 8, for example, split up, doesn't know where her mum and dad are, doesn't know if they're alive or dead, doesn't know where she is, doesn't know what's going on. And, somebody's going to feed her and virtually almost look after her, so you hang around. Interesting, look at the rest of the adverts and the pieces on this. The top one, the order of worship the mayor, John Crosby. John Crosby was a slave trader. And in fact, John Crosby owned the Angola, which brought the Africans in that were being sold. Francis Gildart, the town clerk. Francis Gildart was a slave trader. George Drinkwater was not a slave trader, but he was a dealer in goods cultivated by enslaved people. We've seen the 11 Negroes one. The good ship Fanny and Betty, suitable for the coasting trade. Again, George Drinkwater's the broker. And the good brig, the Royal Charlotte, very fit for the African trade. And that was sold, and it was sold, and it did become a slave ship. So there you've got, what, 1, 2, 3, 4 adverts and a text piece, and they've all got connections with slavery in one column, in one newspaper, on one day in 1766. And by this day, 1766, the trade was at no means at its height. William Roscoe, much lauded, Liverpool abolitionist. We have to be careful looking at Roscoe. I'm sorry to do this to you, but he was in business with a slave trader. Thomas Leyland, who we've seen before, was in banking partnership with William Roscoe. So at the time, of course, banks have joint and several liability. So the partners of the banks knew what each other had for breakfast, never mind what business they're into. And he would have known perfectly well that Thomas Leyland was a slave trader. He was proposed and seconded for Parliament in 1806, proposed by Thomas Earl and seconded by Thomas Leyland. Talk too much about Thomas Leyland. Thomas Earl, the Earl family, between them, they were all involved in slavery, fathers, sons, brothers, what have you. And between them, they were responsible for taking 40,000 kidnapped Africans to the Americas. When Roscoe spoke in Parliament, he only spoke about 3 times. He was only in Parliament for 6 months. And he spoke asking for free trade with the East Indies. And then he spoke for asking for compensation for slave traders. Earl and Leyland had funded Roscoe's election campaign. This was a time, remember, when elections were done by bribery, often. And General Gascoigne, who was one of the other candidates who spent £12,000 on the election, said, my opponents had deeper pockets than I did. Roscoe spent £24,000 on his election expenses. And his father-in-law was involved in a slave voyage. Another problem I have to give you, and have to lay this at you, the Rathbones' abolition to slavery. It's well known that the Rathbones were opposed to slavery. They had a timber company, and they wouldn't sell timber to people who were making slave ships. It's all very good. They would, however, happily buy timber, happily buy mahogany from Jamaica that was cultivated by enslaved people. They were in business. They had several business partnerships, and many of the partnerships involved people who were involved, either directly involved in the slave trade or were involved in goods cultivated by enslaved people. William Rathbone III bought an enslaved person. He paid £35, including Tom, a 14-year-old boy who was, inverted commas, very clean in his habits. And he bought a set of clothes, and he paid for shipping to send poor Tom to Germany as a present for a friend. Just leave that with you for a little while. Doing a slave voyage was sometimes a step to other things. And so it was with Robert Scott and George Green. They both undertook one slave voyage. And the document on the left is a document I have in my possession, which I own. And it is a bond in the sum of £400, about the equivalent of 400,000 now, that enabled Mr. Scott and Mr. Green to set up an insurance brokerage and to do business with a London insurance company. This was their bond, that they would be collecting premiums for this company, and if they didn't pass it on, the company had £400 of their money to make good their losses. So they had used one slave voyage to make themselves enough money to go into another business. So as well as the involvement in the direct slave trade, there's an involvement in Liverpool in owning enslaved people predominantly in the West Indies and in South America. And when, as I said, in 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, part of this act was as for compensation for people who were having been forced to free their enslaved people. This wasn't compensation to people who've been unpaid for many years, people who've been treated with utmost barbarity for years. This was compensation to people who owned those people. £20 million was paid by the government. This was 40% of the Treasury's income in 1833. To do this, they had to borrow £15 million. Government stumped at 5 million, they had to borrow 15 million. Even then, there was no magic money tree. If you paid income tax at any time up to 2015, you were paying interest on that loan. That loan was still in existence up to 2015 when it was reorganized then. There is a technical reason why it was. It wasn't that colossal amount that you had to do. It was a technical reason why it had to be done, which we won't go into. But you were undoubtedly paying interest on that loan if you paid tax up to 2015. Some of the people from Liverpool who received money in compensation was John Gladstone, later Sir John Gladstone, father of William Ewart Gladstone, Prime Minister 4 times. 2 other sons were members of Parliament, and he received over 99,000, around about £100,000 in money. This was a colossal sum of money, an eye-watering sum of money. Joseph Brooks Yates, West Indian merchant. By West Indian merchant, these are people who are importing goods from the West Indies. We'll talk about what they imported later. And it was an eponymous title for them. £79,000. John Tinney. Some of you may remember a company called Sandbach Tinney. I certainly remember it from my banking time. And he had £112,000. He was again West India merchants. And John Moss. John Moss was a banker and a West India merchant and received £40,000. And one of the main movers in the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, John Moss. So goods imported into Liverpool. Again, I'm going to have to turn away and read these. Sugar came from the West Indies, came from Demerara in the north coast of, it's now Guyana in the north coast of South America. Rum, made from sugar. Coffee, turpentine, copper, raw copper, copper ore. Turpentine, mahogany, tobacco, ginger, rice, hides, cocoa bean, palm oil, and indigo. All came from the West Indies, from Central and Southern America. It's important perhaps to remember here that Brazil didn't abolish slavery until 1886. I beg your pardon, 1880. Cuba abolished in 1886. So when you have Rathbones in the 1870s buying coffee in Brazil and then selling it in New York, it was coffee cultivated by enslaved people. Cotton, perhaps the biggest item that came into Liverpool, the most valuable. Half of all the world's cotton mills were in Lancashire. And in 1830, we still have slavery. 1 million people in Britain are directly involved in the cotton trade. The population between 15 and 20 million then, probably nearer to 20 million, but 1 million people in the country were directly involved in the cotton trade. Majority of them, by far the greatest majority of them, in Lancashire, in the hinterland around Liverpool. 1858, Again, you still have cotton in 1858 produced by enslaved people in the southern states of America and in Brazil. Lots of cotton came from Brazil. 1,500 million yards of cotton cloth was exported through Liverpool in 1858. That will all have been made from cotton imported through Liverpool and spun and woven in Lancashire. Railway investors, lots of people who received, especially people who received compensation under the Slavery Abolition Act, invested in the railways. Rains Appleton, £2,500. These are huge amounts. You've got to remember, when this was happening, 1820s, 1830s, a private soldier in a line regiment in the army would be earning £18 a year. A private soldier in the army now earns about 19,000 a year. So this is how the interaction of the money is. Thomas Bush invested 3,000. Peter Whitfield Branca invested 18,640. Robert Brown, £173,000. Luke Crossley, 5,700. We're going to come across Luke Crossley again in a minute. Charles Lawrence, who we're going to come across again in a minute, £99,000. And John Moss, who we've just seen, the banker, £40,000, West Indian merchant. He was able to invest a total of £220,000 in railways up and down the country, predominantly £60,000 in the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. We've got here some images. We've got top left, we've got the CSS Alabama, Confederate States ship Alabama. During the American Civil War, 1861-65, Liverpool, to a degree, sided with the South. To be fair, it was more Americans living in Liverpool sided with the South. But the likes of the Alabama, which was a commerce raider, the most successful commerce raider ever, more successful than any U-boat in the First or Second World War, sunk or captured 65 American merchant ships, was built at Laird's in Birkenhead and financed through Liverpool, through Fraser Trenholm, the cotton people. And underneath that, we've got a picture of the Liver Inn at Waterloo. If you head north through the city centre and you're off to Crosby and Southport Way, you'll go past the Liver Inn at the traffic lights. You seem to stop at it. Doesn't matter which direction you come at those lights from, you always stop. I've never gone through those lights. The Liver Inn, a chap called Charles Dunwoody Bullock, Confederate agent in Liverpool, did a lot of his planning there. He lived in Waterloo. He did a lot of planning. The two pictures on the left are interesting because they're what are called blockade runners. And it was common during the American Civil War for guns and ammunition to go into the South, into the southern states, and to be funded by cotton coming out of it. And a lot of Liverpool merchants were involved in this trade. After a while, it became obvious that the Confederate government couldn't particularly afford to buy the guns and ammunition. They were giving them promissory notes and government stocks and this sort of thing. And they diverted their attention to doing very nice dresses. Flushing toilets were very popular. I hear they still are. I don't believe in them myself, but I hear they're still popular. Brandy, wine, and luxury goods were taken in, and cotton was brought out through the blockade. It very nearly brought Britain and America to war. Fortunes were made, and fortunes could be lost. But there are two Liverpool blockade runners in those pictures. So the Wavertree connection. Bluecoat School. This cutting is inadequately reproduced because I did it this afternoon with my camera. I apologise. Bluecoat School is going to look at its connections with slavery and is probably going to remove Blundell's name from it all. Blundell founded the school. Blundell was involved. We've seen him before. He was involved in slave voyages, but the Blundells are also very heavily involved as West Indian merchants, very big involvement as West Indian merchants. That's where they made lots of their money. And they're doing this. Well, 4 of the 6 houses named after people linked with slavery. And I'm pleased, to be honest, that the school is going to look at this. Because I think once the school looks at it and starts discussing it and debating it, then that's probably the first step it needs to take. And then decisions are made. I'm personally not enormously fond of things being renamed. I would rather, in many ways, that an explanation was given as to the involvement or the background of the people, rather than renaming them, because they tend just to disappear if you do that. Holy Trinity Church. Many churches, of course, were built in Liverpool during the 18th, 19th century. The council paid for some of them. Others were built by subscribers. Some were built by individual legacy. And I'm not really signalling out the Holy Trinity Church. It's just I was asked to talk about a Wavertree connection, and that's your parish church. For that, read any number of other churches in Liverpool. So the trustees in 1790, John Backhouse is involved in 99 slave voyages with the Tarleton family usually. Peter Baker, 49. Edward Grayson, 20 slave voyages. Henry Littledale was a West African merchant. Littledale's heavily involved in cotton. Thomas Park, 63 slave voyages. William Pole, 32. And Christopher Shaw, 8 slave voyages. They would have contributed to the church. As for that matter, St. George's in Everton, St. Michael's in Aigburth, and a number of others. We're going to see a number of others. You know, please don't think that I'm being desperately rude about Holy Trinity Church. So some Wavertree residents, you'll probably know these people more than I do. You'll certainly know their houses more than I do. Francis Grundy in Wellington Lodge, an owner of enslaved people, as was Charles Lawrence. We talked about Charles Lawrence just before. Robert Semple, Richmond Lodge. Luke Thomas Crossley invested £7,500 in the railways. He was an owner of enslaved people. James Pownall, who seems to have got Mount Vernon in his name the other way around. The owner of enslaved people again. And Sandown Park, Francis Shand, West Indian merchant. It's perhaps noticeable that the people on this list are owners of enslaved people or West Indian merchants. And looking at it, these people seem to make more money than the majority of slave traders. And it was certainly a longer, a longer lasting investment, a longer lasting income stream than slave trading was. And Wavertree was a very pleasant, well, it still is a very pleasant, leafy suburb of Liverpool. And to get away from the town centre, away from the smells, away from the noise, to have a nice house in the countryside would have been very appealing to these people, and why not? In 1907, the 700th anniversary of Liverpool, in the procession that went with it, there was the slave trade car. There's no embarrassment there. There you have the slave train car and various people involved in it, representing enslaved people and representing various slave traders there. So Liverpool slavery memorials, there are a couple, there's a few. We have here at the Canning Graving Docks, there's an interpretation board which talks about slave ships using the Canning Graving Docks. And this is often shown up as Liverpool's only slavery memorial. Well, it isn't, in fact, because we have these two. We have on the left, this is the memorial to John Newton in the ferry ticket office at the pier head. If you ever go into the ferry ticket office, you may or may not go in there, and it's on the wall to the right as you go through the front doors. It's quite up high, and it's very obvious when you look at it. The top right-hand corner of it represents Europe. The bottom right-hand corner represents Africa. The big oval thing in the middle is the Atlantic Ocean, and the wide thing down to the left-hand side are the Americas. And John Newton's involvement in Liverpool was he did 3 slave voyages as a captain, and he also invested in one slave voyage with John Manstey after he gave up he had some sort of a fit and he couldn't go to sea again. He invested in a slave voyage with John Manstey after that. Some considerable length of time after he retired from slavery, which he described as a very good occupation and a very profitable one. He wrote the hymn Amazing Grace. He also wrote the hymn of, it just came to my mind, it's gone, it matters not. Amazing Grace he wrote. But this was a long time after his involvement in the slave trade in Liverpool. He'd retired and he was a clergyman by this stage. The picture on the right is a statue called Reconciliation, and it's in Bold Street in city centre. Excuse me, the lane that goes through to Concert Square. And it was originally put up as in 89 as Reconciliation, and there were three of them. There was one in Liverpool, one in Glasgow, and one in Belfast. And it was a case of post-industrial cities being together, and they'd gone through the bad times together. Yeah, they'd gone through the boom times, they'd gone through the bad times, and they were reinventing themselves. They were being reborn in 89. And this statue did it. The chap, Stephen Broadhurst, who did it, reinvented his own statue later in the early 2000s. And two more statues were made. One is in West Africa, a place I can't quite remember just at the moment. Anyways, in West Africa. And the other one is in Richmond, in Virginia, in the United States. And it's reconciliation over the slave trade. Now, this is fine, this all works, but it wasn't the original purpose of the statue. That's been changed. And the statue in Africa and the statue in America both have interpretation boards attached to them, attached to the bottom of the leg part of it, if you like, the square bit of the bottom of the leg. Incidentally, it was made out of iron instead of bronze, and it's not weathered well. And they've got interpretation boards talking about the slave trade, the triangular slave trade. The one in Liverpool doesn't. It was never intended to be attached to the statue. It was intended to be attached to the buildings to the side of it, which was at the time was Waterstones, but it was never put up. And just got to ask yourself the question why that wasn't done. I don't know. So Liverpool slavery legacy. You've got Rathbones, made their money from the slave trade in one way or the other. Brown Shipley. Brown Shipley was the company started by Sir William Brown, William Brown Street, and they made their money initially from the importation of goods cultivated by enslaved people. And William Brown actually did a slave voyage, although in the company records, it says he didn't realize it was a slave voyage until after it had happened. Right. You've got the symbol on the right there, the liver bird of the Bank of Liverpool and the grasshopper of Martin's Bank, because they had Haywood's Bank and the Bank of Liverpool very much tied up in the slave trade in one form or the other, to the extent where Martin's Bank buildings, when it was built in 27 by Rouse, Tyson Smith did the bas relief of two African boys holding bags of gold, and a statue of Neptune above them as Liverpool. Come around clockwise, we've got the Bluecoat School, which is spoken about. Bluecoat Chambers, again, the same issue as the Bluecoat School, founded by Blundell. And then we've got, next one round, we've got the former, excuse me, I beg your pardon, the former Royal Insurance offices, corner of North John Street and Dale Street. The Royal Insurance has its background undoubtedly in people who were both slave traders and owners of enslaved people. Then next to that, you've got the former NatWest on Castle Street. I was delighted when I went past it recently. It said sold on it, but that was originally Parr's Bank. And the Parr family were big slave traders, and they were big, oddly enough, not gun manufacturers. They didn't make guns, but they were gun stockists. They bought and sold guns. By guns, I'm talking muskets and flintlock pistols and that sort of stuff. And they founded the bank. And again, their business heavily involved in the slave trade. And in the bottom left-hand corner, I was speaking to Rob before we started. I started my career with what was then the Midland Bank, which is now HSBC. And that's where I started my career. The bank there, 36 Castle Street, the corner of Brunswick Street and Castle Street, opposite the Bank of England. And that started as Leyland and Bullen's Bank. We talked about Thomas Leyland just before. This is the bank he started and he founded. So it's very interesting. We've got Barclays, the NatWest, which is part of the Royal Bank of Scotland group, and the old Leyland and Bullen's Bank became the Midland, became HSBC, all with strong links to slavery and slave trade. Interestingly enough, if you look on their websites about their history, while they do talk about some of the banks that make them up, they don't mention anything about slave trade or slavery for some reason. I can't understand why. 4 churches, I said I wasn't isolating Holy Trinity. St. Anne's in Aigburth, St. Andrew's, Rodney Street, St. Agnes and St. Pancras, and St. Thomas's in Seaforth, which I think has now been demolished, were all wholly or partially funded by people involved in the slave trade. John Moss was one of 3 people to fund St. Anne's in Aigburth, on Aigburth Road near Aigburth Vale there. And, these were all funded. And sadly with the churches, it doesn't stop at churches, because if you look through the list of people who contributed towards the cost of the Anglican Cathedral, there's many families there that their wealth, whilst the people obviously not who gave the money, the family wealth had come from the slave trade, from trade in slave-grown goods, from compensation from owning enslaved people. And it holds true for the cathedral. And the Bishop's Throne, which is shown on the right there, a nice postcard of Bishop's Throne. And there's a little plaque by the steps to the Bishop's Throne. It says, in memory of Richard Watt, citizen of Liverpool, 1724 to 1796. Richard Watt's coat of arms, which you'd find at Speke Hall, where he lived, is on the left there, and includes 3 Negro heads on it, on the top of the thing, above the 3 arrows. Richard Watt was a slave trader and an owner of enslaved people, and was a very considerable trader in slave-grown goods, predominantly sugar and tobacco. So right to the very top of the Anglican Church, the connection with slavery goes, and through other things that we've seen in Liverpool today. And that's about it. I'm going to give you an unashamed advert for my last slide. My most recent book, published in June this year, June or July, Slave Streets of Liverpool, talking about streets that are named after people involved in the slave trade or abolitionists. £12.50 plus £2 postage and packing. If you want a signed copy, that's the same price. And I showed you a couple of pages from the history of Liverpool, William Enfield's book from 1773, which is £15 post-free. It is rather more difficult to get Dr. Enfield to sign the book, as he's been dead for nearly 200 years now. But that's about it. Thank you all very much for listening. I hope you could all hear me all the time, and I hope we didn't lose the thing. And what I'll do now is I'll click stop share so you can see me again if there are questions to ask. So I'm just going to click this, and you might get me if you're unlucky. Yes. Okay.
Right.
There we go.
There we go. Well, I've got to say, people can hear me. I think just appreciation for fantastic. I think that was really, really good. I don't know if you can hear the claps, but they are loud and clear for you, David.
Thank you very much.
A terrific thing. I know those of us from Liverpool, we thought we knew a wee bit, but you've enlightened us, educated us, informed us of our, I was going to say rich history, but it's a dark history of which we need to know. I know personally, I agree with you. I don't think that things should be taken down or I think we should be educated about why they are there. And after the debate, that then we can decide what happens. And like you, with the blue coat of a house of education, that's exactly what it should be doing. And it's such a shame it's taken 200 years for them to come to the idea of what education is about. But hey, you know, that's a personal view, and that's what
I agree with it entirely, Rob. I'm happy that they're now having the discussion.
Yeah, that's what
they should have done it before. Yes, absolutely, but they're doing it.
Yes,
they're having
absolutely.
the discussion.
No, the thing is just those are the past that perhaps they did know hidden away in the dark cupboards, and they must have known, but you know, time wasn't right for them. I appreciate everybody listening. David, can you open up the chat?
Yes, I've got that.
And see what questions there are that you've not answered.
I don't know if I put my specs on, it's very small. Robert, you've asked how many slaves came to Liverpool? An interesting question. I would say it was in the hundreds rather than 1,000. I doubt that it got to 1,000. It's not recorded per se. But what also happened was that there were always almost always casualties amongst the crews of slave ships through illness or accidents or whatever. And they didn't have big crews anyway. So say you start out with a crew of 20 and you lose 4 or 5 people, you've got real trouble on your hands. So it was a case that happened. Well, young guy leaning against the mast there, he's a big, strong, fit lad. Just put a line through his name in the manifest and we'll say he's died. And you can pull on this rope, can't you? You can haul this sail in, you can do this, you can do that. And black sailors came back to Liverpool that way. They were on the ship and they came back to Liverpool. They may have signed on for another ship. They may have stayed on that ship, or they may have settled in town. Liverpool has one of the earliest black communities in Britain, which dates to the middle of the 18th century. So for people to come and to go into servitude, I would say in the hundreds at most. You're also asking here, what happened to the freed slaves after 1837? Not a whole lot. They started to get paid for their labor instead of being unpaid. But the same people that ran the plantations carried on running the plantations and carried on producing cotton and sugar and what have you, and almost certainly had people in, pretty desperate situations, but they paid them. So that was probably the only difference, really. I have that book, highly recommended. Kerry Mays, thank you very much indeed. That's a very nice comment. Thank you.
and that's from Canada, so that's great.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. Are there still guided tours of the building's location of slavery in Liverpool? From Ian. Not at present, Ian. A chap called Lawrence Westgraff, who's doing a PhD at University of Liverpool, does tours. But what I'd sort of say is, watch this space. My son is the other half of the Dusty Teapot Company, and his master's is in my master's in studies international slavery studies. You may be surprised to hear. His master's is in media production, video production, and we're going to do some virtual tours of Liverpool where we can visit sites and, without you traipsing all over the city and sort of on a cold, wet Sunday afternoon in January, you can have a look at the various sites around Liverpool from those. But we'll be telling everybody when that happens. But that's something that we've got planned. Hang on.
David, there's a last question. Were the merchants who did the odd trips to West Africa that would pick up slaves to make extra money? And that's come from Maureen.
From Maureen. Yes. It's a very, very good question, Maureen. Thank you, wherever you are, Maureen. Thank you very much for that. Yes, and it went more than that. there were quite a lot of people who did one slave voyage. You could, for example, you as the Wavertree Society, there'll be, within that society, there'll be groups of friends, and 6 or 7 of you could get together and say, we'll do a slave voyage. And you'd each chip in £1,000, and you do a slave voyage, and you'd probably get a decent return on it, 15, 20, up to, I've got to say, up to 100% return you could make on this. But also, there were people who, like me, who's not as wealthy as all you, and I might say, well, tell you what I'll do. I'll go to Robert, who I know is a captain on a slave ship, and I bought this box of 10 muskets. Could you take this down to Africa for me and see what you can get? And Robert might say, well, okay, well, I've got some, with those 10 muskets, I have bought an African, a kidnapped African, and I'll take him across to the Americas, I'll sell him, and I'll give you the profit from there. To sell someone in America is anything from sort of £25 to £35, £45, about the cost of a family car these days. That's what you're talking about. But also, what you might have done was, okay, well, with those muskets, I have bought some ivory. So what I'll do, take the ivory across to the West Indies, and I'll flog the ivory, and I'll buy some sugar, or I'll buy some rum, and I'll bring that back. And I, being a nice little chap, I'd give Rob 10, 20% of the money that he'd made for me, and I'd make a profit. And this happened. This was common. That they say that shopkeepers would do it, and people like this. So again, the involvement in Liverpool went very deep and very wide. So yes, Maureen, that's a very good question, Maureen. Thank you for that. Is that it? That's about it.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up to 8:45, from what I can see.
Oh, is it? Oh, heavens.
I think it's just been such a fascinating talk and an evening for us. What I'd ask everybody, if you could, obviously, hopefully you are members of the society, and if not, join us. It's a mere £5 per household if you're not a member. Come and join us. More members we've got, better. But most of all, go into our website and email to us your thoughts of how it can be, of how we can improve the talk if we have future talks on Zoom. Hopefully, the magic vaccine will work, and then we might even get together properly for a meeting when we'll invite another speaker and David come back in a year's time with some more information and another talk, because I know I speak for everybody. It's just been fascinating, the amount of effort and information you've put in and the way it's been presented. I hope everybody's enjoyed it. I hope everybody's got something out of it. We've tried our best, but let us know, because we'll just be walking in the dark unless we have some feedback from you. And if you think it hasn't worked, please tell us. We will try to improve. We'll try to get it better. But it's great to see people again. And I'll say it again, obviously, thanks for not coming out, but joining us. Just as a little thought that one of your slides of the echo about the school, the Bluecoat School. Yes. Unfortunately, straight right on the same page was something about Black Friday, which I thought was most ironic. If you have a look at it again.
Yes, it is, of course. Yes, I've got it. I've got it here. You're right. There you are.
Yeah, I thought that was most ironic for tonight's talk, but there you go. You can't get away from it. On behalf of everybody, David, thank you very, very much. And
you're very welcome.
And hopefully you'll be friends of us and come back in the future. And within you'll get another warm welcome. Again, I ask everybody to show their appreciation to David. I thought it was terrific.